So again, my name is Genevieve Chavez Mitchell, and I have the honor and privilege this morning of welcoming you and welcoming our opening and keynote speaker, Vanessa Roanhorse. I would like to say that Vanessa is such an inspiring person, has such an inspiring story, and is doing such inspiring work. And if I said nothing else, that would be that would share with you how powerful this woman is. She is the CEO and founder of Roanhorse Consulting. She's of the Dene tribe, and she is leading this Roanhorse Consulting, which is an Indigenous woman-led think tank that co-designs wealth and power building efforts, that invests in thoughtful community-led efforts that put people in the center. Vanessa is the co-founder of Native Women Lead, and a national organization that lifts Indigenous women in business. She sits on the boards of the New Mexico Association of Grantmakers, Native Community Capital, the Delta Institute, Zebras Unite, and is an advisor to Angels of Impact Fund, Village Capital Finance Forward, and Decolonizing Wealth's Indigenous Philanthropy Advisory Group. This is one busy woman. We're so delighted to have her today, and she's going to be sharing her talk on bringing women back into the circle. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you, Genevieve. That makes me tired listening to that. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Yatse Abena to you all this morning. I just want to thank the team at UNM Anderson for just reaching out and asking me to be part of today's session, which is, to me and the work I've been building, some of the most important topics that we need to be discussing in light of so much that has happened. It's wonderful to be here and be centering what I think is really a future state for business, for strength, resiliency, and cultural diversity across all sectors. And so with that, my name is Vanessa Roanhorse. I am the Navajo. I grew up on the Navajo Nation. I currently live here in Albuquerque, New Mexico on Tiwa lands with my husband and our 7-year-old. I have a twin sister, one younger sister, and 3 younger brothers. My twin sister and I are the eldest in our family, and so that means we will eventually be carrying our family's history through our clanship system. And so for my Dana people out there, Vanessa Roanhorse and it is good to be here with you all this morning. So you heard a little bit about who I am, but let me tell you just a little bit more. So I am a mother, I am a partner, I am a sister, I am an Indigenous person, I'm a business owner, and as my hair grays, I am becoming more of a matriarch. I moved back to New Mexico about 5.5 years ago. I had been living in Chicago for close to 15 years. Primarily finding my work and passion at a sustainable non-for-profit called the Delta Institute, who I now get to be a board member of. The Delta Institute's mission is to work with communities across the Midwest to solve complex environmental challenges. During my time there, I found myself leading and working across the city, the state, and the region to support the design and implementation of green infrastructure, green workforce development, and creating behavior change efforts that actually supported the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Being young and not really having the purview I do as a more senior person, it was incredible work, but it was also incredibly heartbreaking work. Climate change and how that was trickling into our communities, into our leaders, into our schools, and how the natural systems have been pushed to the maximum, and finding myself trying to build solutions to address those. At the time, I really didn't understand how hard it was and how complex it was. But what was also incredible, in its own way, a different kind of heartbreak, was that I found myself doing this work, sitting consistently at tables that communities have built with their leaders, their organizers, and their activists. And most of the time, they were communities of color, leaders of color, and women who were facing incredible and sometimes insurmountable environmental degradation in their neighborhoods, cities, towns, and natural systems. And it was this work, this sitting at these tables, these learning from these teachers, that planted seeds that I wouldn't realize would come to fruition years later upon my return back to New Mexico. But it was in these conversations where people were feeding me from their own kitchens and I was holding other people's babies on my lap as we talked about systems and policy and resources and solutions. The question that kept popping to my mind was, who has power? Where does it come from? Who decides who gets to make choices for themselves? What is agency? And at what point did business's only purpose become just to make money? I had to ask myself as I was sitting there, and we talk a lot in the world about investing in people who are the closest to the solution or closest to the problem because they have the solution. If that was true, I wasn't seeing that. I wasn't seeing that in play. And so what are we supposed to do for those people who are creating these solutions with real business models and real revenue opportunity here behind it, but they lack direct access to capital. They lack direct access to networks. They lack direct access to those with decision-making power. And oftentimes they lacked academic experience, that technical expertise experience, and therefore are dismissed. So let me pause and tell you a little bit about my background because it matters. So let me just start with the thing. I'm an art school dropout. I wanted to be an experimental avant-garde filmmaker. I wanted to wear muumuus and wear gaudy jewelry and sit in like dark cinema rooms and pontificating, the future of art. And so I went to school. I graduated high school and I went to school to study film and video production. And I was about less than 12 credits from graduation when I had this deep realization. If I want to work in film, I should just go work in film. What am I doing here? What am I doing trying to do this in this vacuum? And so for me, I just decided to pack up and I moved to California. I spent years in California trying to break in, trying to find jobs that I felt would like showcase my brilliance, trying to find networks to let me in. But the reality is, this was the early 2000s. The kinds of positions people, when they looked at me and they saw who I was relegated to, sadly, were what they would consider the sort of more feminine sectors: wardrobe, design, makeup. And I was not able to be taken seriously as a film editor. I just did not present as someone who they could trust to tell the story. And, I failed hard. Like, it was one of the biggest failures of my life. I really believed in this and I sacrificed my educational career because I thought this was the path. You'll find I do this a lot. But after finding many years of not doing projects that I cared about, not projects that I felt represented what I believe the world should look like, I realized I was also not very good at it. My skills as an editor were pretty poor, and that really I was average, and that needed to change. Something in my life needed to change. So I packed up and I moved to Chicago, where my twin sister was getting her master's degree in public health. It was this move that I found myself eventually finding work at the Delta Institute. And the skill sets that I had learned in filmmaking somehow were very applicable. So when we decided to move to New Mexico, first of all, we also returned to New Mexico and Albuquerque because my sister was here. That's a pattern also in my life that I like to share. But the other reason is we had a son. And I don't know about for many of you with families or how this worked for you, but having a child crystallized something that I didn't understand that avant-garde filmmaker wearing a muumuu and gaudy jewelry, it never occurred to me that I needed to make a living, a true living. It also didn't occur to me that I am building a legacy, that I am building a pathway forward for future generations until he showed up. So back in 2015, we ripped the Band-Aid off and we drove on out from Chicago to Albuquerque. I had no job prospects. Thank God my husband, who was an artist, carpenter, and organic farmer, had the wherewithal to apply for a job at the city of Albuquerque's Botanic Gardens. And that first year, he was able to help us it was a nominal income, so much more less than what we were making. But thank God was able to secure something. I, on the other hand, could not find a job to save my life. And what I realized was the pathways to opportunity and access can sometimes be defined by paperwork, can be defined by your networks. And that's okay. But the pathway for opportunity and success, sometimes we just don't realize we have that agency ourselves. So as has happened most throughout my life, my sister welcomed us into her home. And I spent the first 3 months living back in New Mexico trying to find a job. Unsuccessful, and also just struggling to figure out how do I make ends meet. I had to lean into my networks. And thank God in Chicago, I had done enough work around sustainability, city planning, infrastructure, green infrastructure development, that I was able to reach into that network and find out that the city of Albuquerque was actually putting in a huge bus rapid transit project. And with the work that I had done, which was building different types of funding mechanisms for minority contractors in the green energy sector, to also building community-led initiatives in primarily Black and Mexican-American immigrant neighborhoods around specific environmental challenges, I had some actual tools to be able to consider how do we bring this together. And so I was able to land my first contract. And the only thing I knew about business at the time was you better separate your personal and business finances. That was pretty much the extent of my entrepreneurship knowledge. And so unceremoniously and boringly, Roanhorse Consulting was born. I had one foot out of the door for about 2 years, because this was never supposed to be a career. This was never supposed to be the job, right? I always imagined I would return back to some type of working systems in which there was somebody else in charge. And yet 5 years later, with staff and doing national and international initiatives now, this is what we do. And Genevieve shared a little bit, but I'd like to read a little bit more. Roanhorse Consulting is an Indigenous women-led think tank. We have over 30 years of combined experience reframing and strengthening systems with a justice lens. We co-create opportunities for communities, leaders, and organizations through power building and self-determination. And we do this because we believe in place-based strategies to support community-led solutions in addressing social, economic, health, and well-being challenges. We co-create opportunities and spaces for communities, leaders, and organizations to challenge systemic barriers through power building and self-determination. And finally, we want to reframe and strengthen the systems through an equity and justice lens. All of the work that we're focused on is the work that we're speaking of today in the entire session, which is how do we recenter our conversations around power? How do we seek harmony on who has it? But also, how are we rebuilding our relationship with the world around us? So Native Women Lead, let's start there. So Native Women Lead is founded by 8 Indigenous women. We founded it back in 2017. Our mission is to revolutionize systems and inspire innovation by investing in Native women in business. And we do this by co-creating and convening our community to build coalition while honoring our culture, creativity, and connections. My own journey to start Roanhorse Consulting was painful, lonely, and every place I went, I felt something was amiss. Something just wasn't connecting for me. And I wanted to build something. I wanted to build business that put not only people at the center, but a business that was built around mutualism and not individualism, that was focused on the we and not the me. I wanted to build a business that centered kinship and relationships as part of how we create harmony in our world. But I wasn't seeing that, and I didn't know where to go. Gratefully, I found these 7 other women, and we had all had the same experiences. We all found ourselves, one, not identifying with the language of entrepreneurship, but having deep ancestral knowledge of business. Like, we have always had the entrepreneurial spirit as Indigenous people, but as Indigenous women, we've always figured out how to rub 2 pennies together to make a nickel. And I don't think that's unique within Indigenous people, but that's my personal lived experience. And so for me, Native Women Lead became a vehicle. It became a vehicle and a rallying call, because guess what? I was not the only one that felt that way. Rather, my co-founders and the other thousands of Indigenous women business owners and entrepreneurs across the globe felt the same exact way. What I was also hearing was a slow building, slow amplifying collection of people, voices, and networks across the globe drumming to the same beat. And it wasn't just Indigenous people, it wasn't just Indigenous women, it was everywhere. And it was at this time, there was also a growing conversation starting to happen around, 1, what is social entrepreneurship? 2, why aren't we seeing more capital moving? Where, and I can't tell you how many meetings I was in where people like, there's more than enough capital out there. But the question was like, okay, if there's more than enough capital, why isn't it moving? And why are we seeing capital choices being sort of siloed in these like very specific sectors? And, you know, if anyone has, I'm sure you've all heard the venture capital stats, primarily going to white men. And so my question kept swimming around, if there's a groundswell of people wanting to build business differently, we have to marry this with capital. If we're not talking about capital, we're not talking about where power can sometimes live. And capital is complex because it's been very traumatic and harmful for so many people. And so how do we actually rebuild a relationship with money? Which led to the question again, that brought me back to where I was sitting in a Chicago Pilsen table around in a room, which is who has the power and who's making the decisions. So 2020 was a hard year. 2020 put into light how fragile systems can be, how fragile our economic system is, and how fragile it is when we aren't investing in real infrastructure. And we saw that particularly around public health infrastructure. And as a Diné person, as a Native person, it was one of the most painful years to see what was happening to our communities because of COVID. But it was also very frustrating to have people ask, how is it possible you don't have running water on the reservation? How is it possible you don't have broadband? Because these are rallying calls that we have asked for since we signed our treaties. But I think it was something bigger, which is we as the United States for the first time had to look in the mirror and say, yes, we do have major economic challenges, and they are presenting themselves in so many diversity of ways. The fact that we have children at the border still living in like horrible conditions, these are all interconnected. And the question again comes back to what makes things different? And I want to share, the World Economic Forum recently put out a report on the gender gap. And they highlighted that countries that had female-led leadership had done better and performed better in not only handling COVID-19 pandemic, but actually address some of the economic downturns that we're seeing in other places. Now, we can just say, well, that's not America, that's not this place. But I think it's something for us to just hold on to. But we also know from that same report that it's going to take 95 years to close the gender gap in political representation. You know, we are so blessed to have Secretary Holland now at the state doing the work. But the progress towards economic participation and opportunity has regressed. I believe, I cannot remember the author, but she stated, what we have seen with COVID-19 is also women are the United States care infrastructure. Women have had to leave their jobs, their careers, and close their businesses to be the caretakers of our children and elders, and oftentimes our communities. And that with the deteriorating situation around gender parity, as low as, and this is global, as low as 57%, that actually represents a massive 257 years before we reach gender parity. 257 years before women will reach parity in our ability to have power and influence. And as we know, COVID hit our women the hardest. And as we continue to see from the disease itself in general, but it's implicitly impacted women of color the most. And at the alarming rates that we're seeing our women having to leave the market and now are fully employed, what are we going to do? When we think about social enterprise and impact investing, we have to recognize all things are connected. So without looking very far, we can see that comprehensive paid family and medical leave, childcare, and home care, which are currently unavailable right now and are pretty much unaffordable. And it's overwhelmingly our women who are taking the role of being unpaid caretakers for our children, parents, families, and communities. As a result, we are being forced to leave our jobs. And as these other critical benefits disappear, like retirement and healthcare, we're also seeing the progress that we have made. We do not even know how that impact will affect our communities the longest. And if we recognize in our Indigenous communities that Native women are 2/3 the breadwinners and economic drivers, what is that going to do? What is that systemic effect going to have? And I have to ask the question, what is missing and why do we continue to return to these huge racial and gender injustices? You know, we have to keep talking about it because women, in particular women of color, are not only carrying the brunt of these inequities, but they are also the solutions to how we address them. And when I talk about bringing women back into the circle, I mean that in all of our communities and cultures, women were equal in that center. Women and men and the many experiences within gender had equal part and parcel. We have lost that relationship. We have lost that harmony in which men and women equally, I'm not demanding that men give up all of their power. What I'm saying is we have to be reminded that when we have true harmony of leadership and representation, our systems look different, our communities look different, our cultures look different. So how are we going to not only just bring women back into the circle, but what are the tools in front of us today that we can actually do this with? So first, I want to say bringing women back into the circle is my whole body of work. I am a woman. I am an Indigenous woman. My journey is me learning that I have agency and power. My journey has been me willing to put some of that on the line. And as a result, as we talk about leaving the ladder down, that is my interest in why we have created Roanhorse Consulting, why we continue to push with Native Women Lead, and why we continue to ask the question of like, what is power building and why does power sharing matter? And as my colleague and friend, Rodney Foxworth of Common Future has said many times, what do we need to do to shift capital to shift power? So here are a couple ideas, stuff we're kicking around. One is we need to be investing with values and align it with people. And they have to be clear and succinct. What does that mean? And in that investing with values and people, we have to ask ourselves about redefining risk. Who really should be carrying the burden, particularly if we talk oftentimes about a charity model of investing versus a true solidarity model of investing. Solidarity recognizes there are systemic and huge cultural constructs that have kept people out of power. We also recognize that in the solidarity model, that it's about letting the people lead and the resource follow. It's about building true partnership between those with power and those without. And in that, how do those with power share and give up power? And in order to do that, we have to think about that through an investing lens. And some of that has to come from how do we talk about risk? I think about the traditional 5 C's of credit. And the two that pop up always for me are credit score and collateral. What happens if you've never been allowed to build collateral? And what happens if your credit score is horrendous because you've never been able to make a living wage? You've never been allowed to purchase property. Back home on my reservation, you can't use property as collateral. So how do you actually build credit and collateral? So I push back on investing with values. We need to say, what are your values, those with money and power? What are the people's values? Why are you trying to serve? And let's rethink through those values and redefine risk. My next one is we have to push those with the money. I mean, we have to push them to think differently and more creatively. They need to put their entire portfolios, not just the 5%, but the 95% have to be considered. And more importantly, they have the ability to look at those portfolios and make them work outside of extractive indexes and sectors. Because the more we continue to put our resources into those sectors, the less power and ability for us to write our own relationship with the earth, period. But also to reevaluate the fact that like we live within finite resources. So what is that? There is a whole movement around that, but we have to hold each other accountable and we have to be willing to have these very tough conversations, which is so difficult because we're unpackaging a lot of things. But this is the work if we're serious about our future, not just mine, but my son's children's. So let's look at tools such as, so these are tools. How can we support our philanthropy and our investors to really start to play around, looking at recoverable grants, creating more integrated capital structures so that we can create opportunity? That means putting together grant making, asset transfers with like patient affordable lending term, recoverable grants, convertible debts, you name it. But the job is to be creative. The job is to put the risk on those with the most with those who have the most, not those who have the most to lose. So we want to need to do that. The others, we need to see more communities of color running funds, being in leadership positions around wealth and capital. We need more BIPOC fund managers and decision makers. We have actually stuff doing that right now in New Mexico. New Senda Credit Union has their co-op capital program, which is a character-based program. And it's close to $1 million to entrepreneurs and communities that would never be able to access finance. Pre-COVID, it was 0% default. Post-COVID, maybe 1%. We have things here. We also, I just want to remind everyone, build the world you want to see. Ask the questions that matter to you. Your money is being used in all of these landscapes. We need to start to rebuild our relationship with money and power. And the only way we're going to do that is if we're willing to take ownership that our dollar means something and where we put our dollar matters. So it's on us as people, as individuals, to hold our money accountable and to be the owners of where we want our money to go. And finally, I just want to leave with everyone because part of this is just returning to ancestral practices. Our cultures and communities had much more thoughtful social designed practices around wealth, tandas, cooperatives, potlatch, feast. And so I want to leave you with the 7 principles of the Indigenous worldview by Leanne Simpson, who is an Indigenous scholar and woman thinker. The 7 principles are, first, knowledge is holistic, cyclic, and dependent upon relationships and connections to living and non-living beings and entities. Second, there are many truths, and these truths are dependent upon individual experiences. Third, everything is alive. Fourth, all things are equal. Fifth, the land is sacred. And sixth, the relationship between people and the spiritual world is important. And seventh, human beings are the least important in the world. I want to thank you, Ahihat. I hope to send you off on a powerful day of learning and dreaming. Thank you.